to the entertainment Talkin' Sports.
What is going on, football fans? Back at it with another New York Giants video. And before I get started on the video, just want to give a quick shout out to one of my subscribers. This morning, I had posted in my community notes, obviously being that it's a dead time in the sports world, I'm trying to give you guys the type of content that you guys might want to watch. I asked you guys what types of videos or live streams would you guys be interested in, and Tim Jim responded with, can you do a scenario where the Giants don't get top-rated free agents? Can you do a free agent signings that are mediocre and realistic and that we may really get? Well, the first thing I'll say to Tim is thank you for the suggestion. I do think some of the top-tier guys the New York Giants definitely could end up with. Someone like Jadeveon Clowney or Byron Jones. I think that's certainly on the radar. But in this video, I will go over some of the guys that I have not hit home with. Some guys that are bargain basement type deals at certain positions of need. Guys that I think either have a lot of upside and are still relatively young, or guys that are older that have been productive players that maybe you get on a pretty cheap deal due to the fact of their age. Now, I didn't go over everybody. I went over about 5 players. I could have hit on McCourty. I could have hit on Dante Fowler, a young pass rusher that I think a lot of teams will be interested in, and a number of other guys that I've mentioned in the past. But I went over some guys at various positions, both on offense and defense, that I think the New York Giants could potentially be interested in if the price is right. And some of these guys we've heard about in the past, but I do not think they'll be at the top of the market at each individual position. So let's get started on the first free agent, that being Breshad Perriman, a guy I have not really talked about a lot, and he has not really been linked to the New York Giants, but to be honest with you, when you really look into him, he is the type of prospect, if the New York Giants decide to attack wide receiver in free agency, who will be very affordable. He only made $4 million last year. Now, he did play well down the stretch. He had his first 100-yard game of his career. He's a former first-round pick, number 25, 26, I think it was overall, by the Baltimore Ravens. And I remember when he was coming into the league, and I'm going to pull up his draft report in a second, people were comparing him to Julio Jones, and he's the exact type of wide receiver in terms of, his attributes that I would think the New York Giants would be looking for. He's tall, he's fast. We're looking for that type of wide receiver on the outside to fit this system, and we lack height at that position. Of course, if you were to bring in Perriman on a reasonable contract, you wouldn't have to worry about the wide receiver position in the draft. Something that we've talked about, maybe the Giants think about drafting around 3 and 4. This is the one wide receiver, when I really look at it, if the price is right, that maybe the New York Giants could actually be potentially interested in. Like I said, he took off with the Bucs last year. I think the last 3 or 4 games of the year when they had some injuries at the position, which is why maybe he's going to garner some interest. He was only making $4 million, though, last year, being that he was a first-round bust early on in his career with the Baltimore Ravens. But this was his draft report coming out. Rare combination of size, top-end speed, and suddenness that can be found in some of the best receivers in the game. Arrow is pointed way up for Perriman, and he is one of the most discussed prospects in draft rooms around the league. His drops will drive teams crazy, but his physical traits and ability to hit the big play should warrant early consideration. And like I said, he's tall. And the other thing that was very impressive about Perriman when he got his opportunity with the Bucs last year due to injuries, over those last 3 or 4 games when he was the starter, didn't drop a single pass. And I think that's why his stock is definitely trending up. I would imagine he's going to go for a lot more than the $4 million he made last year, but I don't think you're quite looking at a $9 or $10 million receiver. You might be able to bring in this guy who's still, I think, either 25, maybe 26 years old, on maybe a $6 or $7 million contract over 2 or 3 years. And if that is the case, could certainly be a guy, a bargain guy at the wide receiver position that maybe the New York Giants could certainly have their eyes on come free agency. So keep an eye out for him. Next guy we're going to talk about is a guy that, I had my eyes on last year, and I think a lot of New York Giants fans did. The Giants were rumored to be potentially interested in Darrell Williams of the Carolina Panthers. He, of course, was a former draft pick of Dave Gettleman. We're going to get into another former Dave Gettleman draft pick in a little bit as well. And he was one of the better tackles on the free agency market last year. It was a very thin class. This year's class is definitely much stronger, having guys like Costanzo and Conklin and Bulaga. So Darrell Williams has definitely been, I guess, pushed down a little bit. Last year, he only signed a 1-year deal with the Carolina Panthers because he was coming off an injury, and this year he did not perform that well, but you might be able to get him on a bargain deal, a guy who's still relatively young. I think he's 27. This guy is a former top-tier tackle in the league, which is why a lot of Giants fans had their sights set on him last year, and maybe on a very cheap contract, $5, $6, $7 million a year, whatever it may be, maybe you bring this guy in. Definitely worth a look if the price is right. And this is what they had to say about him based off his performance last year on an article I was able to dig up. Williams played every position along the Carolina line except center last season, and it's easy to envision him landing a starting job at any of those spots this offseason. But because he's coming off a so-so campaign preceded by a major injury, which was the year before, he's getting a lot less publicity than fellow impending free agent offensive linemen Andrew Whitworth, Jack Conklin, Brian Bulaga, Jason Peters, Brandon Sheriff, and Joe Thuney. So there you have it. He's definitely a guy that maybe the Giants could be interested in if you're looking for a bargain basement type offensive lineman, especially when you factor in his connection to Dave Gettleman. And he's still relatively young, coming off an injury, and he's had great success earlier on throughout his career. So Darrell Williams, another guy, if you're looking for a cheap alternative on the offensive line, maybe to fill in at that right tackle, see how he does, sign him on a short-term contract that the Giants could look to bring in. Next guy we're going to talk about is the center that a lot of people have talked about, and that is Connor McGovern from the Denver Broncos. Now, the Denver Broncos had a very underwhelming offensive line last year, and it might be why McGovern is not ranked on the same level as some of those offensive linemen I ranked previously. Now, I would think McGovern, who's still young, is probably still going to get at least $10 million a year on a 4-year contract, but center is a huge problem for the New York Giants. And when you look at what McGovern was able to do with a poor offensive line last year, if you were able to stick him in between our two guards on this offensive line, definitely a guy you want to consider. They could decide to spend $10 to $11 million a year on the center position in free agency and then maybe attack the tackle in the NFL draft. But this is what was said about Connor McGovern. McGovern was simply fantastic in 2019. According to Pro Football Focus, he allowed just 1 sack and was whistled for 0 penalties in 1,013 snaps. Capable of playing guard and center, McGovern is also one of the most versatile linemen headed to the market. And yeah, he's a pretty well-known name, but by most standards, he's not, one of the upper echelon offensive linemen in this year's class. He's kind of that second tier, probably one of the most, probably the second or third most sought after center, and definitely a guy you want to keep your eye on, and I'm sure the New York Giants will monitor him as well as a guy that they could potentially try to bring in to help that offensive line. So we kind of went over the two biggest needs for the New York Giants, be it the offensive line and the wide receiver on the offensive side of the football. When it comes to defense, this is a guy I've mentioned in one of my previous videos, and he's a guy that I think you could get very good value, who's an extremely productive player, but because of his age, maybe on a 2 or 3 year deal, he's 32 years old, he could make a lot of sense, and that, of course, is Mario Addison. Mario Addison has been as productive as anybody at his position over the last 4 years. He's had 39 sacks, also a former draft pick of Dave Gettleman, one of the more underrated finds in Dave Gettleman's career. Mario Addison is a very, very good football player. He's coming off a year, I think he had about 10 sacks last year. This is the news that came out where the Panthers, it seems as if Mario Addison is set to test the market. Now, he definitely could re-sign with the Panthers, but he wants to see what his value is on the open market. The Panthers have expressed interest in re-signing defensive end Mario Addison, but the 32-year-old plans to test the free agent market per league sources. Doesn't mean the two sides won't find a common ground. Addison has 39 sacks in the past 4 years. And then it went on more than a lot of other players that they went on the show, top-tier edge rushers in the article. But yeah, here's another guy, Gettleman guy, and he has experience playing both D-end and outside linebacker. Somewhat versatile. A guy that's not going to cost you as much as, one of these big-time pass rushers because of his age, but you still might get pretty good production for the next 2 or 3 years, and you don't have to make a 4 or 5 year commitment. So Addison's a guy that the Giants could potentially have some interest in as well if they're looking for some value free agents. And then finally, the last guy I wanted to pull up for you guys is a guy a lot of my subscribers have pointed out, and he's a very good slot cornerback. That being Kendall Fuller, formerly of the Washington Redskins. Then he was traded to the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, I don't know what his market's going to be. He could be between maybe $8 and $10 million. A fantastic slot corner. Matter of fact, if you go back to 2018, a lot of people had him ranked the best slot corner in football. Last year, I think he only played 11 games for the Chiefs. I think he had an injury to his right hand, if I'm not mistaken. Graded out to be around 60 or so on PFF, but still a very good slot corner. Now, the question is, do the New York Giants value the slot corner position as much as a lot of teams do? I say it all the time. Offenses are using the slot more and more often in today's game, and a guy like Kendall Fuller could certainly be a guy that could help the New York Giants taking away some of those, targets on short and intermediate routes. A key piece of a late January trade between Washington and Kansas City, Fuller emerged a season ago into one of the highest graded cornerbacks in the league, independent of alignment. His efficiency, then they went on to say his efficiency. And yeah, so it goes on to say he was one of the best slot corners in the league. And I read several articles, some of which said he was the best slot corner in 2018. And again, depending on his price. But Logan Ryan is probably, from what I've heard at least, the highest graded slot corner in this year's free agency market. Fuller you might get for slightly less. But the one thing I have heard about Fuller is that he is potentially interested in going back to the Washington Redskins, the team that initially drafted him. We'll have to wait and see how that all plays out, but the Redskins may have them on his radar. But that's another guy that the New York Giants, for maybe $8 to $10 million, could have interest in at the cornerback position. So those are a few depth guys. I'm not telling you guys that we're going to get any of them, but those are some guys, if I was an NFL GM, that I would certainly have my eye on at some position of needs for the New York Giants. Like I said, I didn't mention McCourty, another guy, Fowler. There's a bunch of guys I'm sure that you guys could throw in the comments below, but I wanted to point out 5 or 6 guys for you guys. Thank you for the suggestion, and I'll try to have a few more videos up for you guys in the coming days. As always, guys, if you liked what you watched, please subscribe, drop a comment. Maybe give me a little thumbs up. Cheers.